This is just a sort of bit of a talk really around the use of self as a male social worker working with the victims of domestic abuse. So we've got some objectives I'm going to try and cover tonight. So I'll do a bit about me, why I've chosen this topic, why is this an issue that I feel needs to be something we do under a PhD, so why we're completing this PhD, the challenges that I'm anticipating to face, and my plans so far. And I was always told a good presentation had a picture of a cute dog, so that bit done. So, a little bit about me. I started my journey 2013 in social work. I've worked in child protection, front door, referral and assessment teams throughout my entire career. I've only ever worked within children's services. I completed a BA Honours here at Worcester University in my social work. I then did a Masters in Psychology, and I'm currently doing my PhD here again at Worcester University. I worked through all of my social care career. I worked through my career until I became a team manager of a MASH team, so a multi-agency safeguarding hub, so which essentially was just a front door team for every children's referral into social care. Currently, as of January this year, I became a lecturer at Gloucester University, and I currently teach the social work degree and the master's course as part of my role. I've always worked within customer service-based careers prior to doing social work or at that supporting caring role. So I've worked with young adults with autism, adults with acquired brain injuries, and that's led me to where I am 11 years into my journey as a social worker. So that's a bit about me, but also I'm a 6'1" white male. I'm about 18 stone and covered in tattoos, so I'm not exactly small. And I'm a social worker. So I guess the question really is, why is this important to mention? And the reason why is, what do you see? What do you see when you see me? In case, what do the families see when we work with them? And if I think about victims of domestic abuse, what are they seeing when I knock that front door? So do they see my skills and experiences? Do they see a caring, nurturing career? Do they see strong education founded upon health and social care? Do they see that drive to enhance positive male role models? Do they see the empathy, emotional warmth, resilience, that non-judgmental sort of person-focused practice that I aim for? And do they see that I can be an active listener and that I'm a promoter of positive change? Probably not. What they see is the physical person. They see the 6'1", large tattooed white male who's a social worker. So there's that element of power. And if they've got children, you know what the stigma is around social workers. There's that threat to their children, their family. And then you've got the social stigma that they see when they see me. They see social stigma related to men as threats when we think about domestic abuse. And then there's this blanket label that's created. So men abuse, thus for all men are abusers. Okay. So why did I choose this topic? So as a male social worker, practicing directly with families, domestic abuse became a very significant part of my daily workload. I would say probably 50% of referrals that I dealt with as a social worker had an element of domestic abuse as a concerning factor. I found myself often challenged when working with a family, particularly if the victim's perpetrator was a male, and more often than not when the victim was a female. I would often get things said to me such as, I don't want to work with a man, you scare me, I don't feel safe, you're a trigger, or you don't know what it's like to be abused or to be scared. I'll put it out to you, but has anyone else encountered anything in practice or any other experiences where they've had similar sort of things said to them because of the gender? Weird not being able to see the screen.
Can you see my hand up? No,
I can't see anything, I'm afraid. So all I can say is my tablet. Just speak up, it's all good.
Well, I'm Kevin. My first placement was in a charity as a trainee, like social worker, in a charity organisation which mostly worked with women. I was not, don't call it discrimination, you call it allocated any men who'd actually had domestic abuse type of links or problems with them, and the actual organizer said that the ladies normally say they don't want to work with a man. So it's like engrossed within the organisation, not just the people who say it. So I don't know whether I just went with it because it was a good place to work, and I thought I learned lots. But it's just, I thought it was interesting that they didn't put me as a man, a mature man, with any ladies who needed to talk about anything to do with social problems they had or challenges.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. No, and then yeah, this is, and I'll touch upon this a bit later on actually. But yeah, absolutely. That's sort of been my sort of experience as a male social worker as well. So yeah, so what was your name? Sorry,
Kevin.
Kevin. Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate that. So as a student and a newly qualified social worker, in practice, I didn't really feel I could challenge this. These were the sort of things I dealt with as well quite often in my practice. And I did feel I could challenge it, and I would often just ask my manager to reallocate me. And that through that inexperience of being able to sort of challenge people, whether that's the parents that I'm working with, or even the decisions being made by colleagues or the managers, I didn't feel I could do that safely and effectively while showing empathy. So as a student newly qualified, I sort of followed suit. So I just went along with the norm that was happening. As I became more experienced social worker, no training was ever really given in university, up on placements or in practice, to alleviate these sort of barriers or misconceptions of men in social work working with victims of domestic abuse. I knew it was wrong. There was nothing in place around sort of policies or procedures that would support me as a male social worker. Often it came down to, and it sounds horrible, but often came down to a threat of complaints. So as I got more experience, I'd sort of be challenging with parents. Actually, I think I could really help you, and I really want to show you that positive male role model, and actually try to support you and understand your needs. But then it would obviously come to a stage where they'd say, if you don't change me, I'm just going to put a complaint into the manager. Or if that happened, that's when things would get very difficult, and then I'd just be reallocated. Despite knowing I could have done equally as good a job as a female counterpart, I would often be reallocated because the organisation didn't want to risk a complaint. And then as I became a team manager, I did find myself trying to implement that pathway for positive change, but then I was met with the same challenges from senior management, where it was expected that I was to avoid complaints. You was audited for how many complaints you'd had that month. And within my team of social workers, there were 17 social workers. I had 4 males, and more than competent to do the job, supporting any family or any victim of domestic abuse. But you'd still get the same challenges from families. I don't want to work with a man. The second we phoned up from the referral coming in, it was a man that phoned up to speak to the person and say, look, we would like to come and visit you, discuss this more. Even at the initial stage of the phone call, it'd be, can you send a woman out, please? And that would, I'd say, is probably about 80 to 90% of all referrals that came through. That was the sort of response we were getting. So even wanting to make that change, it was very difficult to action that as a team manager. And as a male social worker, as Mike, I felt unsafe and vulnerable when working with victims of domestic abuse in the end. And this was more around those that refused to work with me. And there was that fear that if you push too much as a male social worker and I'm not making the assumption that all victims of domestic abuse are female, because they're not. But if it was a female victim, for example, to have that ability to actually challenge that person a bit in a safe and an empathetic way, there was that risk then that you were going to have allegations made against you where you've come in, you've tried bullying me, you scared me into doing something I didn't want to do. I didn't want to work with a man. So that made me feel vulnerable as a social worker. And it also sort of went on to actually, even if the person did say I could work with them, it's around that use of self and that emotional intelligence when you're working with victims of domestic abuse, to the extent of, where do you sit in that room? Where do you position yourself that's respectful, safe for both you and that victim of the abuse? If they became upset, is it appropriate for you to, and I saw many female colleagues do this, where they would have somebody that was crying, as you'd expect, and they think nothing, just go up to them and say, come on, it's okay, we can get through this. Now, there's a difference between a female social worker doing that and a male social worker doing that, because there's all sorts of risks or allegations that can be made that aren't really covered in your journey as a social worker, as a male social worker. But now I want to help create a shift in that change and that knowledge and the understanding from why this happens from the grassroots level when you're studying for your degree to when you're on placement, and then the ongoing training within local authorities as well. And I'm hoping that through the research I do, and after talking to victims around maybe what some of these barriers felt like for them, we might be able to come to a place where we can make a decision around how to best work with victims of domestic abuse.
Can I ask a question? I just wondered, so if you worked with a female and they were accepting of you doing that work with them, and I'm just thinking back to my time in child protection when, again, there was a lot of ladies that I've worked with that have been subjected to this. How you found, because, you know, when you had the programmes that you expected the males to go on to, you know, and the males that I were working with, some of them, you know, wanted to make the positive change. Others would try and be quite threatening towards you, etc. When you've been working and got as far as working with a male, have you found they've been more receptive to you because you're a male and less trying to intimidate you less?
And it works. It's a double-sided coin really on that one, because I found that when you worked with male victims of domestic abuse, either there was that relatability, which I'm assuming, you know, a female working with a female, they just feel a bit more secure and safe with. But actually, for the men that you work with that are victims of domestic abuse, either they can relate to you and they're happy to talk to you, but there's also the other side where there's, and it's not fair on them, but there's that element of sort of demasculation, sort of fear of shame, embarrassment that as a man you've been a victim of domestic abuse, and it's really hard to get that balance around, you know, how you discuss that with somebody. But equally, what's interesting, and we'll touch on a bit later on, but that's me as a male working with a male victim. If there's a female victim of domestic abuse and their partner is a female, the female social worker would still be allocated.
Right. Okay.
So it almost, when you think about intersectionality, it's like, where's the balance? How does this work? Because as a male, I'm expected to work with male victims of domestic abuse, and there's probably you know, I'm still in the process of doing a lot of research, but there probably is some research that suggests that actually it does support that person, but equally that's just reinforcing what I'm going through as a male worker for female victims or any victim of domestic abuse. To why can't a female social worker work with a male? It's that double-edged sword really, and I think it is difficult. Okay. So overall, I felt a bit unsafe, and I didn't really feel all the time I had the skills to manage that situation. And it was a bit of a taboo subject, so it wasn't really something that was spoke about in the office. It wasn't sort of things that you could really talk about openly. That's how I felt. Okay. Just some little few stats and facts for you. Okay, so the Office for National Statistics recorded 2022 that 91% of perpetrators of domestic abuse with a female victim were male. Okay. And it said that in the end of 2023, 1.4 million women reported being victims of domestic abuse, 751,000 men. Skills for Care released that in 2021, 18% approximately of social care workforce were male, meaning it's a 4.51 ratio female social workers to male social workers. And why this is important is a lot of the time we talk about supervision, reflexive supervision, and it doesn't have to be in an actual formal supervision with your team manager or supervisor. Sometimes that conversation over the desk on the car journey on the way back home from a visit is a really good opportunity to talk through what's been going on. Now, if there's only 1 in every 5 social workers, say, are men, the opportunities for men to talk to other men about how they felt is restricted. It's reduced quite significantly. And then it's finding another male social worker that's actually, you know, if you're trying to find that positive change to see how somebody did work successfully with a victim of domestic abuse and they allowed them to work, actually they're quite sparse. So finding somebody you could talk to, hey, what did you do? How did you overcome it? It just wasn't something you could really talk about. And then interestingly, Women's Aid have advertised on their latest posts that most of our roles are open to women only. under the Equality Act 2010. And the Women's Aid are a great organisation. They do a lot of support for victims of domestic abuse. But when we talk about institutionalised sort of biases, they're already saying that men can't work with women. So if the main domestic abuse organisation is saying we don't employ men, that's already saying that men are a risk, and they're not helping create that opportunity for male social workers or male support workers or male counsellors to have that chance to be a positive male role model. So this one's quite a bulky text, but I won't go through it all, don't worry. So lack of training. So what are the issues that I found so far? These are just a few of the areas that I'm looking to cover. Okay, so the lack of training, which we touched upon. So no training provided in the degree around men in social work with working with victims of domestic abuse. Interestingly, I'll never forget my experience when I was a student social worker at university, and we had a domestic abuse team come in, and there were 27 students in my class, 4 of us were males, and they gave me and the other 3 males a card, and it just said, please treat women respectfully, do not control, do not abuse, treat women as you would expect to be treated. And all the women in the class were given a card, Mr. Wrong versus Mr. Right. And it was just straight away that label that men are abusers. And I'm not disputing the fact that statistically more men are reported as abusers of as perpetrators of domestic abuse. But even at an educational level, a degree where we're trying to teach social workers not to be oppressive, we were doing that already. We were saying that men, we were singled out as the 4 men as being a risk to women. Yet there are equally as many, it's unreported, but it suggested that there was just as many male victims of domestic abuse, same-sex relationships, domestic abuse, but in those sessions men are isolated. So that lack of training isn't there. The unspoken rules and assumptions in practice. So common practice, as we said, is often it's women that are more suited to work with victims of domestic abuse. As the gentleman said earlier on, it was that unwritten rule, you just don't work with the women, you work with the male victims. Okay. Social constructs and media portrayal. Every poster you look at when it comes to domestic abuse, the images of a female, usually with bruising. If you look at adverts for domestic abuse awareness, it's the female victim, it's the male that's the perpetrator. Everything around our social media and social constructs makes us link the abuse to men, which then creates a real difficult barrier for professionals to be working with victims of domestic abuse. Question masculinity. So the traditional notions around masculinity are challenged when working in a caring role, such as social care. So male social workers often face this scrutiny or that ridicule of being called unmanly. You shouldn't. Why are you doing this? It's a woman's job, or you can't be a supportive person. Or that use of touch, you can't touch somebody's hand if they're crying. It's not appropriate for a man to do that. But why is it not appropriate for a man to do that? Lack of research. There is very, very little research on this at the moment. I found some research done in India and some in Australia, and not specifically to domestic abuse, but men working in a female-led sort of career within social work. And the bits of research I have found on male social workers working in domestic abuse focuses directly on men working with male victims of domestic abuse. There's nothing on female victims. Gender bias and stereotypes. So, how men are labelled as perpetrators. I've said this quite a few times now. So, as such, all men are a risk. And if you're a risk, you should not be able to work with vulnerable victims of domestic abuse. And we sort of mentioned it earlier. However, females are still allowed and encouraged within organisations to be the people that work within domestic abuse, whether that's female to female relationships or male to male or male to female. It's deemed safe and acceptable in all situations. And that intersectional oppression, so we need to consider the impact of race, identify gender, ethnicity, religion, language, geographics, how these things really impact the way victims of domestic abuse see you and how you present to them, and also our social graces. So when we talk about the impacts of our decisions that we make in that moment, we talk about social graces, what is your gender, what's your religion, what's your race, how were you brought up, what was the culture around your lived experiences, All of these inform your own values and ethics, and these can create barriers as well when working with victims of domestic abuse. So why this PhD? Like I said, there's been very little research, almost no research completed by male social workers. And I want to try and be that catalyst for change for the male social workers in practice. I said both from those studying at the moment, looking to come into the field, and those that are already in practice. I want to draw upon the lived experiences of both and the voices of both victims of domestic abuse and social workers to understand why these anxieties exist when working with male social workers, and how male social workers feel about this aspect of their career. I think it's really important to get the voice of the victims here. And I said earlier that I did my degree in social work and my master's in psychology, so I want to try and bring collaboration of both sort of concepts. So that's psychological theory, so considering things around like strength-based approaches, intersectionality, trauma-informed care from a psychological point, and then also combining that with the social work theories, try and bridge that gap as in why people, whether it's a victim of domestic abuse or whether it's the social worker or the team manager, why they're not able to work in this way at the moment, and what might be creating those barriers, to see how, and I want to see how these barriers can be forged to create a safer and effective working relationship. So the use of self. So when we talk about the use of self, this is like your emotional intelligence as well. But as a male, let's say a large male, when I'd obviously go into a property, whether I was working with a victim of domestic abuse, whether I was working with an 8-year-old child, I'm very much aware of my presence and the stature I am. And equally, some people just see men as a threat, so through this stereotyping. So you have to really, really think about the tone of your voice, approaching that more softer, calmer, slower to speaking, so you don't come across as harsh and abrupt. Think about your body language. How are you sitting? Are you sitting here with your arms folded, towering over somebody, or do you adopt an open stance? It's more approachable. Physical proximity, personal space. Say they've got a 3-seater sofa in the property and they're sat at the end, and where do you sit when you go to that first visit? It's just a sofa to sit on. Do you sit next to them because you've got paperwork you need to go through, or is it more appropriate to go at the side? Eye contact, you don't want to be intimidating, but you want to show that you are making eye contact with the person. That physical environment, where are you having these meetings? Is it a neutral place that they feel safe in? Your self-presentation, if you're going in with, I don't do the stereotypical social worker, especially if they've got a check shirt on, but when you think about social workers, you going in with the padded jacket, the briefcase, the satchel, with your clipboard and your lanyard, and you write everything down. So think about what you physically look like when you're working with that person. Active listening, so be able to actually just recite back to them what they're saying, that you're actually interested and you want to listen to them. And then that dynamic self-awareness, that's probably the most sort of prevalent of all of them, really. So this is just be able to notice those subtle changes in the moment. If all of a sudden they become upset or they get anxious, it's just how do you adapt to that? Do I step away a bit? Do I give them time to have a think? Do I need to think about my own emotional intelligence? Am I self-aware? Am I regulating my own emotions? Am I showing empathy? Have I got the right social skills I'm using at the moment? So these things you need to think of in that use of self. And this is dynamic. It's happening throughout the entire visit. There's not just one rule that if you do this every time, you'll manage the situation well, because every person is different, every situation is unique. But if you consider these aspects, it might be just by changing the tone of your voice, or where you sit in that room, or how you present yourself, body language wise, might make a massive difference. Okay. The use of self requires a thoughtful and insightful balance of empathy, self-awareness, attunement of power. You are in there in a position of power. Dynamics, power dynamics, understanding and adaptability of the physical and verbal presence. So if they become upset, or they're getting angry, or they stop talking, how do you adapt to that in that moment? And then empowerment, and ultimately self-protection and service user protection. You need to make sure you're not causing any more emotional harm to the person you're working with, but you're also protecting yourself as a social worker. So some of the challenges I'm facing within the PhD is something called gatekeeping. So I think the only way that we're really going to understand what's going on is by talking to victims of domestic abuse. The biggest challenge is most venues or facilitators of domestic abuse don't allow men into the property alone. So I've been quite fortunate. I've got pre-approval to speak to 5 domestic abuse settings within the Worcestershire and Midlands area. But that's not guaranteed that the people in there are going to want to talk to me. We already know that by not letting men into the property, that there's going to have to be quite ethical and safety plans around how that looks for me to visit. And it's how do I make that accessible for the organisation to know that I'm not putting their residents at more risk of harm. I say, and if this, it's pre-agreed at the moment, if they withdraw that, I'm then back at the drawing board trying to figure out how do I get to talk to victims of domestic abuse in a way that's safe and ethical. So gatekeeping is definitely one of the big barriers I'm facing. The actual interviewing, so being able to arrange this in a safe place to talk, looking at the right sort of sensitivity, emotive language that I'll be using. It's have to be very much a motivational interview sort of technique, and how that's going to look for the people I'm interviewing. So I'm talking about the victims of domestic abuse. What am I going to be offering afterwards? It's okay me going in and asking all these different questions, but I can't leave them high and dry. I need to make sure that there's sort of resources in place if it might be bringing up old sort of emotions and feelings that maybe they buried, they didn't really want to talk about again, or it's triggered something else. I can't just leave them, and I need to make sure that there are sort of support networks in place. And for the social workers that I'll be looking to talk to, again, I'm quite fortunate. I've probably got about 15 to 20 social workers that are happy to talk to me at the moment. So that's probably an easier angle of the interviewing than the victims. Then it's implementing the change. So once I've done all the ethical approvals and it's been agreed and I've got the information and I've done it in a way that's safe and protective for the people that I'm interviewing, and I've analysed all the data and I've come up with some ideas of how better practice can be put in place, that still needs to be implemented. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. I can come up with this research, I can come up with what needs to happen, but we're at a systemic stage where everything that's happening it's embedded from an institutional point of view, both from university, employment and support services around domestic abuse. It's just not something that people are thinking about really. So I think it's going to be really hard to evidence how this will work. So considerations to be made. What do we need to think about when working with victims of domestic abuse within this PhD research? The language used and the terminology. So, down to, is it person a victim or survivor? What do people think? But what would you say, victim or survivor?
I was going to say it's difficult, isn't it? Because, again, thinking of some of the ladies that I work with, if you call, made reference to a survivor, some people would find that empowering, some people would find that really negative. Victim is, some people again don't like to be viewed as a victim. I think that one it's no right or wrong, isn't it? I think it's going to be individual to each of the people that you're supporting.
Absolutely. But I've had the dilemma of thinking about from even the title of my thesis. So I put it as victims of domestic abuse or survivors of domestic abuse. And I've chosen victims at the moment. And it might be that when I start doing the sort of interview stages, it might be something that they bring up. And one of the things I'll ask each person, what would they prefer to be referred to as when I'm considering the title of the thesis. So that's one element. Perpetrator again, perpetrators can also be victims. What led to the situation from being a perpetrator, and then that blame or shame. I need to be really careful about the language that we use because it might create an element where somebody feels that they're at blame for being a victim of domestic abuse, or as a perpetrator, they shamed. we don't know what their lived experiences are, why that's happened. And then ethics and values. So I really need to think about the victim's emotional well-being when I'm writing the questions, when I complete the analysis, and you consider the sensitivity of the questions, the aftercare support, and the power dynamics within those elements of the research. But everything needs to remain that person-centered approach. That's going to be key. They need to feel that they are empowered, they are in charge of what's going on, and this is to support them in the moment they're in now, but also how this can impact the future victims of abuse moving forward.
There is a problem with your theory, a big problem.
Yeah.
You only never know half the story unless you talk to the victim stroke survivor and the perpetrator to get a picture of what's really happened.
Absolutely.
That is the problem I had when I had male victim survivors, and the one indicated he was also possibly a past perpetrator, and it's hard to know the full story and the full picture.
Absolutely, and that's why I put when we consider the language used and terminology, when we say perpetrator, it's because we don't know. They could be a victim in their own right. It could be that they've had adverse experiences in their childhood that have led to them leading to a situation where the choices they made, even though they're not the right choices, are choices they didn't think they could make any other choice to. And that's another element. That's around obviously balancing, when you put in an assessment, are you looking at it holistically from both aspects? And it's very common that you can quite often get a female-male partnership, and there could have been an incident where the male has been assaulted on a Saturday night by the partner, but when the police come round, if that person, and it is sad to say this, but if it is a female victim, they could quite easily say, well, he's hit me 3 times this week, and all of a sudden the incident that was called out for was negated, and this person is now a perpetrator of domestic abuse.
No, it's a civil offence instead.
Yeah, and it just switches, and that's that power imbalance, and that's that gender bias. It's the labelling of men. It's very easy for men to become isolated as the only perpetrator in abusive relationships.
We'll have to have a chat about this.
I'm more than happy to have a chat about that, but that's a different aspect of this. The point of this PhD is to look at how I can work with the reported victims, and I understand they might not always be the victim. They may be.
So your key thing is the possibilities that there may be bias within the victim side, whether it be male or female.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So bit of the I've got to put a bit of theory and methodology in here. So there'd be lots of different theories and methodologies I'm using, but the two that I'm probably focused on more than anything is something called IPA. I can never say these words. Interpretive phenomenological analysis. There we go. As a method, I'm not going to do it again. That's it now. We're done. So this is a qualitative methodology of research, which will enable me as a researcher to draw upon my own experiences as being a male social worker, providing that insider perspective to my research. It'll also enable me to complete in-depth, semi-structured interviews and reflect on some of the challenges and oppressions or successes and lived experiences of not only victims of domestic abuse, but myself and other social workers that I'm aware of. And I'm also going to be focusing quite a lot on trauma-informed theory, as this really highlights and acknowledges the impact of trauma when working with individuals, and it's going to promote the necessity of creating that safe and empowering environment. So we know that when we talk to people around domestic abuse, this is a very, very sensitive and emotive subject, and this can cause quite significant trauma for them. So it's managing that situation that, you're not asking them to relive their experiences of domestic abuse, but more about, we know this happened and it's really unfortunate you experienced domestic abuse, but this is coming back to, I don't want to focus on that, I don't want to bring up the traumas of what you went through, but I'm just more focusing around what after that happened and social services became involved. Maybe they said they didn't want to work with a male. Why? Could you sort of give some explanation as to why that? And they're not going to be told that they're wrong or anything like that. It's just about making sure that we're not bringing up that trauma experiences that they went through, but focusing on the aftermaths of what's happened since. So, why did you not want to work with a male? What led to that? Or if you did work with a male, how did you find that? Did it work well? If it did, why? What worked well? If you worked with them and you still didn't feel you got anything from it, do you think that was because there was a male, or just because it was not a very good social worker at the time? So these are sort of things we need to explore. So my plan so far, when considering I'm 2 years into this PhD, it's only now I'm really feeling I'm starting to get into the actual research aspect of the proposal. I've started to complete my ethics committee applications for both to victims of domestic abuse and social workers. I'm also looking to look at comparable professions. So, because there's hardly any research on male social workers, I'm also thinking about male police officers, teachers, nurses, those sort of aspects where they're going to have connections with victims of domestic abuse potentially, or that caring environment where perhaps judgments are made around whether you should be working there as a male. I'm hoping to talk to about 10 to 15 victims of domestic abuse. If I can get 10, I'll be over the moon. And I'm hoping to talk around about 20 male social workers, and then some extra professionals as well. I want to create a podcast or YouTube channel. That's something I'm thinking about at the moment, to open up debates around this topic, to see how people are feeling, to get people's personal experiences around this. And then this is a lot of information. It's emotive, it's detailed answers I'm getting from people, hopefully. So I'm really thinking about what I'm going to use to analyse this qualitative data. So I'm hoping to use in vivo as a software to help me. AI is becoming more and more advanced. It might be that there's aspects of AI that can help me support analysing this data, or claim trends or patterns within the research data I gather.
Can I just make a comment about disciplines, Mike?
Yeah.
It's quite interesting because you think about perceptions of men. You can see almost double standards in a lot of cases. So an example would be, a common reaction to a male midwife would be, that's a strange job. But you don't see the same thing with a male obstetrician.
No.
I don't think. I had a very interesting conversation with a police officer who investigated sexual crimes, and I've never seen anything empirical about this since. But one of the things that they did, they had a kind of received wisdom position, that when they interviewed people who've been a victim of a sexual assault or a sexual crime, they would use female officers. But they were kind of moving away from that, because there was some suggestion that often women can make invidious comparisons between themselves and female officers. And I guess the kind of thinking behind it was that, you've been a victim of a sexual assault, you might look at a female officer and think, you feel shame, don't you? When something awful like that happens to you, and you might look at a female officer and think, you wouldn't let this happen to you. You wouldn't have got yourself in that position. And I mean, I don't know whether that's something that is part of how crimes are investigated by the police anymore, but that was certainly some thinking that I heard about at the time, really, that maybe there are some problems that might be generated with this very sensitive territory for when women are interviewing other women.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is going to be all transferable. I mean, the focus here is around domestic abuse, because I needed to narrow it down, otherwise this would have been a massive topic. But this is really transferable to most aspects of social work, even down to when you think about working with children. The amount of times I've been into a home where it's been me and a work colleague, and there's 2 or 3 children in the house. We've sat down on the sofas, and the toddlers ran up to my female counterpart, sat on her lap, and they've been talking, and then they jumped off there and jumped into my lap, and then mum or dad go, "Oh, get down." And there's no difference between what it is, but it just doesn't. It sits uncomfortable with parents for them to be sat on a man's lap, but it was okay to be sat on a woman's lap. So these are things that are transferable throughout social work. Absolutely, but I had to focus it down just on this. And as it's BASW, I thought I'd just put that together. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically you've got your PCFs around what you need to achieve as a social worker. And what I've done here is just briefly put some examples of how I think I'm meeting each of these PCFs throughout this PhD, and what this could actually offer moving forward. So, values and ethics, it's that challenging the stigma, maintaining professional boundaries, engaging with ongoing self-reflection, professionalism, professional leadership, every one of these, okay? That's it really for me. I've taken up loads of time. I've been talking for ages. Have you got any questions, anybody? I can come off this bit now, can't I? So we can see people. So any questions for anyone? Kevin, was that your hand from before?
Yeah, it is. I want to play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Looking back at your statistics, you said 1.4 women domestic abuse were known, and then you said 750,000 men, which is equivalent to 2 to 1. So every third person might be a man. Do you think they possibly might be ashamed or not wanting to talk to a woman, so they would just walk away? Because
Possibly.
really, without knowing that you're going to talk to somebody who's maybe a man, they might be against talking to a woman because they've been abused by a woman.
Absolutely, and this is the whole concept is in why is it okay for a female to work with both, whether it's female, male, male, female, but it's okay only for a man to work with a man. And absolutely, and the thing is, it's statistically, unfortunately, men are, it's when I've started looking into this, it's more underreported by men that they've been a victim of domestic abuse. And if you talk to most domestic abuse agencies, especially like Mankind, they talk about this and say actually, they really struggle with empowering men to come forward because there is this element of shame. And I've had social workers in my teams where they've gone, he could have just pushed her away. And you think, right, okay, why have you got that concept? Why do you think that's appropriate?
Yeah.
You wouldn't say that to a female that's a victim. Well, you could have just pushed them away. It doesn't work.
Would a man's or men's domestic abuse support organisation be beneficial in society at the moment? That's what I'm wondering.
Absolutely. I mean, and you have got Mankind out there already. And what we know from sort of, I've spoken to a couple of sort of people that work through Mankind in my role, is that actually the men that do access it really do appreciate the support they get from the services, because there aren't many services that take on men, and especially if you think about where there's dual abuse within the relationship, the most common sort of domestic abuse agencies will only offer support to one person, and they will always favour the female victim. So the men are sort of left, well, you do the perpetrator awareness course, we're going to focus on mom. It's very difficult. So there needs to be more services around, but equally what we don't want to do is be in a situation where all the workers at the Mankind are men, because that just reinforces what I'm trying to get away from for the men working.
You need a balance.
Yeah, I think this is where this is what I talk about, that institutionalised sort of oppression, that at the moment, even down to the job adverts, it's only women that can apply for this job. Actually, if you start bringing in men that could show positive changes and how those healthy relationships can build up and what should be expected in the sort of dynamics between a man and a woman, that's going to offer a better outcome for that victim moving forward, because it's going to break down some of those barriers around the labels they give men at this stage.
It is labelling that is a big challenge. It was obvious when I went from a placement, although they wanted me to do anything and everything, it was normally a labelling type of thing, because I had a few men to talk to who needed help, and only a couple of women, and then it was men's groups, because I was as a mature man, that's where they felt I fit, which I did fit in. I was helping everybody. It's just it's interesting to see your analysis actually applies to where I've just been. There was nothing wrong, and they're very, very good organisation. They're really brilliant, but it's just it just comes. I hadn't even thought about it till you showed it here. It didn't even cross my mind. So
it just becomes practice. Yeah, at least I know I'm on the right track then. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Just thinking about, you mentioned about the use of self and the idea about having relationship skills, and I'm kind of wondering about the idea of a man, and that might be different to say Mike or Kevin or Wayne, was there any sense from your experience that if you had a chance to build a relationship and there was some trust and the sort of things that social workers do, the work can be done effectively, and maybe there's something about the idea of a man? And you think about the agencies, Women's Aid and so on, and they say that for our students as well, that we can only have female students. And I guess their position is a very understandable one about the sensitivity
Yeah.
and the protection of their clients.
Yeah, I mean, I found that those moments where I was able to work with, say, female victims of abuse, where it did work, that relationship turned out really positive, and I even had comments around, "Wow, I didn't know men could be like you. You're quite nice.
Yeah.
Why can?" And you get thinking, "Why can I find somebody like you?" And it wasn't me as in me, but it was me as in a male that was able to show empathy and listen to what was going on and not try and control that situation or take away that empowerment that they needed. So absolutely, I think that works that way. And sometimes it was the fact that coming away from domestic abuse, even going in as a male social worker, where maybe dad has left the scene, dad's not involved. That was a really empowering thing to maybe have that positive male role model within that family dynamics, and a lot of families would attach to that because it was very easy for them to also have this person in their life, because you are in their life during that assessment process or how long you support them under a plan. To have that positive male role model that didn't let them down, that if you said, "I'm going to be here," you were there. If you was going to do something, you did it. That you kept those boundaries in place around expectations that you had of them, but equally what they could have of you. I think it massively sort of helps those working relationships. And sometimes, you'd get some families that wouldn't want to work with a female because they might then, go into terms of where "Well, I don't want to work with her. She was quite catty towards me then. I don't want to work with you. I'll work with you instead." Or sometimes it'd work on the other side, where when we talk about power dynamics, there's this, I've worked with situations where I've been out with sergeants from the police who've been female. We've turned up to a school to do a child protection meeting due to significant what concerns happening at the moment for a child. I've walked in and the school have spoken to me rather than the sergeant, because they felt, well, I must be in charge because I'm the man. And sometimes some families they're happy to work with you because they think, "Oh, you'll get it done. You're a man. You've got probably a bit more power, a bit more sway." And it's not that at all. And sometimes that's a downside to why people might want to work with you, because they just might think, "Oh, I'm going to get a bit more from you as a man." That's sort of things I come across. Any other questions?
In terms of the benefits of a male social worker working with a woman, and if they've had that idea of, "I can't work with a man, I don't want to be around a man," and if that relationship is successful and they can see, like you say, you're reliable, you're trustworthy, etc., then surely the benefits of that is you're helping them to rewrite their narrative.
Absolutely.
In the sense of it may well support them in feeling more worthy and making better choices when they look for a future partner. That this can be achievable.
Yeah.
So it's sort of thinking of the benefits it could bring if they just allow that and relationship to develop, sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So that's not really taken into account, that you can actually change their future.
Well. We go to sort of systemic practice then, and you're looking at that family script, the narrative around why people are feeling a certain way, what's led to them to have this conception of men. Is it because it's been embedded that that's what they experience as their parents and this is what their partnership's done? If you can start changing that narrative, that script, absolutely. I think that's really good, and it sort of helps if we can get to a stage where we understand what those barriers are. And it might be there's a common trend that comes out with these barriers when I talk to the victims. If we can start alleviating those barriers, whether that's through making the social workers aware, actually, we know that from research, women tend to find X, Y, and Z, then they can use that knowledge to adapt how they work with people. So hopefully we can get there. But again, it's changing what's already inherent in practice, which is that challenge. Yeah. Anything else?
I just want to say what you're saying there. This kind of links to what Tim was saying. In some senses, if your study was to capture some successes of male social workers being able to do that would be helpful, wouldn't it, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I speak to the social workers, that's what I'm going to be talking to them. So it'll be a different aspect. What led to you being able to work with a person? How did that happen? What worked well? And if there's trends within how they've achieved that, that's something we can pick for.
I found, just as a side point, when talking to a domestic abuse victim and giving him support, after a few sessions, I gave him a tool to recognise domestic abuse, the Duluth Circle of Domestic Abuse,
Yeah.
and also I gave him what looks like the Duluth Good Relationship example. And after that, he didn't want to come back because he sort of felt like he'd got the answers from those two models, which was amazing. So
Sometimes that can happen, and it's when you start doing work. Again, this is another aspect. When you start working with perpetrators of domestic abuse, and you start understanding what's led them to the decisions they've made, and when you start actually showing that, then if you do a timeline from when they first remember something in their childhood that's impacting, you start going along. I can remember doing a piece of work with somebody, and it went across quite a while. Their timeline was like 20 some odd years, and all of a sudden you saw these patterns where they were hit as a child, they were left to deal with their own sort of issues. There was no support from parents. They ended up living on the streets for a period of time. They relied on violence to make sure they survived. And all these things on their own are quite rare. But when you start building up as a collective picture about what's led to them in that moment, there's been maybe drugs, alcohol, mental health, whatever it might be. All these bits add to why that person's become a perpetrator. It's a part of them. It's not them. So
yeah, I get where you're coming from, but this was the opposite. This was a victim. And he got where he was coming from as a victim and what his lady partner was doing to him from these, he didn't realise what she was doing to manipulate him and causing problems and breakdowns and nearly, worse stuff to himself because of the abuse he was getting from his ex-partner. So once he realised what she was doing, it was like a massive weight off his shoulder. He understood where she was coming from and what she was trying to do to him. And it sort of gave him a basic foundation of defence, is about the best way of putting it. And it's just something so simple that you can give somebody but I'm talking a male person he was obviously, and he's a very nice person. But I was just saying it, so it's the other way around. So you're talking historic influence, but you see, the lady he was with could have had that, but we'll never know. So, but that was interesting. Now, I get where you're coming from. I totally agree with it because I've seen that in somebody else, what you've just described. But the thing is, he still stated he was a victim, really. So this is where it's one of those, you've just got to look after the person you're with and try and support them as best you can. That's the way I look at it, And thank you very much. A brilliant information, and I hope I get the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Is that it? Any more questions? No? Well, thank you very much for listening, guys.